Connected to Chicago with Bill Cameron, covering the big ideas.
So I'm going to veto that bill here today.
The tough choices.
I think it's the right thing to do for the city. It's the right thing to do for the city's workforce.
The farce.
It may be a dream come true.
And the corruption.
A lot about what life is how you deal with your adversities. And it's a true test of who you are.
Plus, special reports and newsmaker interviews, along with an esteemed panel of reporters. Now, Bill Cameron on WLS.
Hey, everybody. We begin this week with our old buddy from the political beat, Andy Shaw, formerly of ABC 7 News, now chief of the Better Government Association. Welcome back, Andy.
Bill, it's always great to be back, even in a different capacity. It reminds me of all the years we chased those rascals together.
We miss your questions on the beat.
You're still chasing them, and I'm scrutinizing them.
That's right.
Remember that great daily? Scrutin. I get scrutined every day.
We're talking about Richard M. Daley.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about what I think is something you're looking into that has a aroma of pay-to-play about it, which you call Cronin's Cronies. Who is Cronin and who are his cronies?
Before I tell you that, let me just say that it's not pay-to-play in the Blago sense. There's nothing illegal here. Okay. But what's interesting is that Dan Cronin, who is the chairman of the DuPage County Board, a former state senator, he heads a board in a county that had blood feuds with Chicago Democrats for all those decades. Remember, we'd cover Pate Phillip and Lee Daniel as they fought with all the Chicago mayors and lawmakers. Now you have Dan Cronin in the new era making nice with those same Democrats. Dan has lagged contracts to 3 firms. One employs Michael Madigan's son, Andrew. One employs Senate President John Cullerton. It's a law firm. And one employs one of Cullerton's top lieutenants, Don Harmon of Oak Park.
All right.
He has lagged, he has ladled out more than $200,000 in legal and insurance business to those 3 firms.
No competitive bidding.
There was competitive bidding, but at the end of the day, you don't have to take the lowest bid. It's a way to get around the perception that you're just giving these out. You have them bid competitively, but lowest bid doesn't always get it. And in one of these cases, lowest bid didn't get it, even though it was competitively bid. There are a lot of things. There's a list of criteria, and you can use that to steer contracts. What's interesting here is that Cronin has a very ambitious Springfield agenda, and that agenda includes some very admirable proposals. He wants to downsize DuPage County government, which is admirable because they have too many units of government there like everywhere else. To get those things passed, he obviously needs the help of Democrats who control Springfield, and so it's interesting to hire 3 very well-connected individuals. I think that increases the likelihood of success. That's a version of pay-to-play, perfectly legal. Here's the only problem. If I'm a DuPage County taxpayer, I have a question for Mr. Cronin. Do you really need to spend tax dollars for these legal and insurance services when you have a staff of individuals, including people who could do it, who are already being paid? That would be my good government perspective. Politically speaking, this is business as usual. Everyone has always done it. But Cronin fancies himself a reformer, and so he should probably be held to a higher standard.
Okay. Is it also, to be cynical or at least skeptical, really, in Illinois, is it also smart politics?
It's totally smart politics. And again, I'm not questioning the strategy, but I ask as a taxpayer advocate whether it's reasonable to spend tax dollars on these outside services when you have a staff that could handle them. It's the same question I would ask Mayor Emanuel about parceling out all these legal services for the excessive force cases involving cops. I could ask any branch of government. When you have lawyers and accountants and people with insurance expertise, why not have them do the job? They're already on the payroll. Why pay double in effect?
Yeah. And Preckwinkle, the Cook County Board President. Tony, you've been investigating her campaign contributions and finding interesting relationships.
And let me preface this by saying we're going to do this with all the elected officials. We're not targeting Tony Preckwinkle. We happened to look at her recently, and what we found was very interesting. She ran on a platform of reform and change, and yet she's raised $5 million since she declared her candidacy in 2009. Of that $5 million, 30% or $1.5 million has come from the unions that she negotiates with and their leaders and their members, and businesses that she awards contracts to. So the question can be raised, is that a conflict? Should you be taking money from unions that you negotiate pension changes and contracts with? Or should you be taking money from businesses that you then award contracts to? It could also have the same appearance of pay to play. Again, perfectly legal. Again, a higher bar when you claim to be a reformer, and that's why we raised the question.
Mm-hmm. She is, of course, a ward committeeman, which makes her into politics a little bit more than one would think from her Reform and Change campaign.
And if you look at who she's endorsed in various races and how she's done business, some of the people she's hired who are friends of friends, people somebody sent,
yes,
she is a ward boss in some ways, but in many other ways, I give her credit. She has certainly been light years ahead of her predecessor, Todd Stroger, when it comes to good government, and she's done a number of good reform things, but fundraising limitations is not one of her reform accomplishments thus far. That's where she's a bit suspect.
I'm also thinking of another case. Tell me what you think of this. A couple of years ago, right after the legislature and the governor raised the state income tax, she put on the county payroll a couple of lame duck legislators who supported the tax and then went off the legislative payroll.
Right, and we wrapped her for that then because that had all the appearances of payback. She, like many other leaders in government, wanted the tax increase, and in a sense, she got what she wanted because tax increases mean money for all branches of government. She rewarded a couple of the folks who voted for the tax increase. Other public officials did the same thing, but again, when you label yourself a reformer and a change agent, organizations like the BGA, watchdogs like us, have to hold you to a higher standard.
Which probably didn't harm their pensions also. So let's move to the arena of pensions and double dipping and all that, and the legislators who keep kicking the can down the road. Is there any hope for real pension reform this spring?
I think they're going to pass something, Bill. The question is, will they pass something strong enough to actually attack the problem, which is the worst in the country in terms of unfunded liability, nearly $100 billion? And if they do something that has teeth, is it constitutional? You may recall, we're both old enough to remember the 1970 Constitutional Convention. Well, it did a lot of things that were beneficial. It also took some steps that now are coming back to haunt government. And one of the things they did back then was to make it very difficult to alter the pension system, to take away a benefit that's already been awarded. And the question that constitutional experts argue about is whether you can diminish any benefit legally. If you can't, then the system's going to sink because it's unsustainable. So the question is, do they pass something that just basically starts to solve the problem but might be constitutional, or do they take an aggressive step that will go a long way to solving it but runs the risk of being unconstitutional? I'm thinking they're more likely to take the baby step first, but I'm not a political reporter anymore, so I'm not as close to it as I used to be.
Yeah, I kind of think they'll do something and call it reform, but it really won't dig too deeply into the $100 billion problem.
And here's the other issue. Politics gets interjected in this very seriously. If Lisa Madigan is going to run for governor, then does Mike Madigan, her father, the House Speaker, does he want to essentially solve the pension problem and make Pat Quinn look like a problem solver? Or would he rather kick the can down the road for 1 year, let Lisa run in the Democratic primary next March, and be able to say that Pat Quinn and others have not done anything about the pension problem, and then if she wins the primary and she's on her road to the governor's mansion, then you pass pension reform to make her life easier?
I would say there's a third option. Let Madigan go ahead and pass pension reform, make Pat Quinn look like a problem solver, so that when he elects his daughter governor in the next year, she's not faced with that huge financial burden of solving the problem herself.
But if you do it now, you help him in a primary. If you wait till the following legislative session, which is still during the governor's campaign season, then you can help her solve the problem if she's the governor. You've done it a year later where it doesn't help Pat Quinn at the same time. These are political plays that
right.
I think people smarter than me in the political arena can argue about.
All of the above can be argued. What do you think of Lisa Madigan? I'm not asking you to endorse anybody because you shouldn't and can't, but would she be such a bad governor?
She's very smart. She's very focused. She's very organized. Those are three terrific traits. She has some reform credentials, which I admire. As AG, she's done some very good things on behalf of consumers, victims of sex crimes, victims of lending abuses, mortgage abuses. So from a consumer protection standpoint, I think it's been a strong office. Her FOIA office has been slow in getting efficient. We stopped using it at the BGA because it took too long to get a FOIA dispute resolved. We started going to court instead where we could get faster action. She says that office is now more efficient. We will have to go back and look at it because we haven't seen it for a while. The one Achilles heel in that office, not from my perspective, generally from everyone's perspective, is she hasn't done much about political corruption. Some argue that it's because she wouldn't want to go near the legislature where her father reigns supreme. She claims she doesn't have the tools. And to some extent, she's right. She doesn't have the power to put a grand jury together without the okay of a state's attorney in a jurisdiction. So with grand jury, you are limited. I would argue that had she aggressively tried to interject herself in more counties with political corruption issues, and offered to work more with states' attorneys, she could have been more active in that arena, but she's chosen to put her energies elsewhere. I will say she's obviously done a good job of winning people's hearts and minds. She is the state's most popular politician, and you find very few people who don't like Lisa Madigan, even those who don't support her.
Yeah, I kind of think she will run and win, although you never can count out Pat Quinn, who vows that he will win because he's a great closer. However...
the other question is, and you were about to ask it, I'm playing political reporter and asking the question of myself, I think you've got a problem if she is going to be governor and he is going to be House Speaker, he being Michael Madigan. Mm-hmm. So the only caveat I'd put on your prediction, I agree with you, I think she's going to run, but I think that part of her running is going to be a very dramatic change in the stature of Mr. Madigan, who I think will either step down or announce that he's stepping down as Speaker, if not as a House member at the same time, because I think that the concept of having a father-daughter in the two top political positions in the state is going to trouble a lot of people, starting with watchdogs and editorial boards, because as a father of three daughters who I love enormously and would do anything for, I still can't imagine trying to negotiate for the people's business with my daughters. Yeah. Better those relationships are kept on a personal level, and maybe a father-daughter could be in business together, but not if the business is my business as a taxpayer and a citizen.
I agree with you that he'll probably abruptly announce his retirement, paving the way for her to be elected without him being a drag, because the media would just hound her and him about the issue.
That would be the only issue in the campaign bill, and it would hound both of them. And he can stay on as Democratic Party chairman, where he controls the levers of financial and political power to some extent anyway, but he's out of that governmental arena where he would be next to her in the power structure of state government. So I think he can have it both ways, and she can have it both ways.
And one fun fact, Andy, is that as we tape this on Friday, we're literally talking about him on his birthday. He's now 71.
Well, I think he's had a very long career. I think it's almost 40 years. And he's earned the right to relax, although I don't think he's the sort that wants to. Mm-hmm. I think if he does this, he'll be doing it out of love and fondness for Lisa, not because he wants to leave the position.
We're talking to Andy Shaw of the BGA about various issues. And Andy, if the legislature does take a baby step on pensions and calls it reform, they might then step over to gaming before the end of the legislative session at the end of next month. What do we have to look out for on gaming?
Well, I think the only issue in gaming is whether the gaming board has enough manpower to vet all of these new licenses. I write a Sunday column in the Sun-Times, and a couple of weeks ago I looked at this issue. You know, we're going to essentially, if the bill passes in its current form, we're going to be the Las Vegas of the Midwest. We're talking about 5 new casinos, slots at racetracks and airports, and this internet gaming, which would be legalized, and this is on top of video poker, which came online earlier this year. You're talking about a monstrous expansion of gaming, and that puts a lot of pressure on the gaming board to vet all of these prospective gaming companies to make sure there's no mob ties or other illegal activities. That is very time-consuming and very labor-intensive, and Aaron Jaffe, who heads the gaming board, says he doesn't have the manpower to handle this at this point. So let's make sure that if we swallow this gigantic gaming bill, and I'm not for it or against it. I personally don't like the idea of balancing budgets on the backs of gamblers, but this is a public policy issue for the lawmakers. If they think that they want to keep some of this Indiana money or Wisconsin money or Iowa money or Missouri gaming money in Illinois, you can justify it on those grounds. But let's be sure that the gaming board has enough power, and let's also clarify a lot of muddiness around the Chicago casino. Who actually owns it, who actually regulates it. The existing bill is not clear in those areas, and it has to be, otherwise it doesn't pass muster.
And moving through the legislature just this week, Andy, is to put even more work on Jaffe's gaming operation by giving them jurisdiction to ride herd on charitable gaming, like bingo nights. There's a jillion of those, and he doesn't have the manpower to do what he's already responsible for overseeing.
Now, the sponsors of the gaming bill claim that the bill includes enough additional money to allow Jaffe to take care of all these things, and Jaffe acknowledges that there is an increase, but he's still very nervous because that puts a lot of pressure on them. The other thing that's of concern in the bill is it mandates a fast tracking of these licenses. It essentially says, get these licenses up and running by X date, even if you haven't thoroughly vetted the applicants, and that's got Jaffe concerned too.
So what could go wrong? Where do you start, huh?
You know, I don't want to be a Jeremiah here for a simple reason.
Okay.
The last 10 years of gaming in Illinois have been remarkably clean under Jaffe. There's been a minimum of mob influence. The reality is that most of the made men who were involved in all this gambling stuff are either dead or in jail. The mob doesn't control big gaming anymore. Those are multinational corporations. So I think the real question is, do we want all this additional gaming in Illinois? Is it really going to bring in a lot of new revenue? Because it may be that it just takes revenue from the existing riverboats and casinos. And lastly, is there enough regulatory authority? I'm not nervous about gaming anymore, even though I don't like it personally. I'm not nervous about it as an entity because I think it's been well regulated and it's run awfully well over the last decade. The question is, do we want to be the Las Vegas of the Midwest? And that's what they have to decide in Springfield.
You're not bothered by government making suckers out of all those players?
I don't like it as a voter and a citizen, but speaking as the president and CEO of the Better Government Association, I want to see it done correctly. I'm not weighing in on whether it's right or wrong. I don't like it, but as a public policy matter, I'll leave it to the folks in Springfield.
Okay, back on pay to play for a little bit. Even the state of Illinois was shamed into a statute which disallows the statewide elected public officials from doing business with those who donate to their campaigns. This would seem logical for, like, the Dan Cronins of the world and the Tony Preckwinkles and the Mayor Emanuels. Any chance of getting something like that done?
Well, you know where we really need that? I know you live in a suburb. Which suburb do you live in?
Lincolnshire.
Okay. The suburbs have a very interesting situation. Do you know that by state statute, every mayor is also a liquor commissioner?
Yes.
And we did an investigation of that. Here's the problem. The liquor commissioner is in charge of licenses and disciplinary action against bars and taverns and restaurants that serve booze and packaged goods stores. Those same mayors are soliciting campaign contributions from the bars and restaurants and taverns that they regulate. That is a classic conflict of interest. That's something that has to be changed in Springfield. Is it possible? You know, there have been some reform measures that have passed. It's really uphill because you're basically taking power away from somebody. Mayors have a municipal league that lobbies for them, and they fight hard to maintain their powers and authority. But in these arenas where you have conflicts like this, no one should be taking campaign cash from an entity they regulate. We could use that law. It's really uphill sledding, though. It's
so obvious, and probably a surprise to some of our listeners that they can do it.
Well, listen, everything is obvious. This is a state with really some of the worst laws in the country when it comes to governing behavior. We allow so much bad behavior by statute. Here's another one. The election boards in all the suburbs are made up of elected officials. A mayor, a village manager, a clerk, an alderman, a trustee, the same people who have a vested interest in keeping strong challengers off the ballot get to make the decisions about who's on the ballot, which is why every election season you have all these ridiculous ballot exclusions. People are kicked off the ballot essentially for wearing the wrong cologne because the elected officials don't want strong challengers out there facing them. That creates an apathetic and a disillusioned public. It's not accidental that only 20% of the people come out to vote in these municipal elections. Recently, the ones in April in the suburbs, the overall turnout was below 20%. People just don't think they can change the system. They're just assuming business as usual is here forever. And the other thing is that 60% of the election contests in Cook County, based on an investigation we did, were either uncontested or had no one on the ballot. That means that more than half are not competitive because of these crazy election rules. You know, we could spend a full day on the radio going through all the laws that are counterproductive and all the laws we do need to reform this state. The problem is we're one of the worst states in the nation, and that's why I could do this BGA job until I were 100. I could last as long as Methuselah, which is 900 years, and I might see a little bit of better government.
That last statistic about the lack of candidates or contests on the ballot is kind of our fault because not enough people either vote at all or get out there and be good government candidates.
When you only have 50% turnout in a presidential election, that means that half the registered voters haven't shown up, and that means a quarter of the adults haven't voted. So a quarter of our voting age citizens elect the most powerful person in the world president. And, of course, it's much, much worse when you get down to the lower levels. I agree with you. I wish we could make everybody vote. I wish we could make everyone pay attention. My column in the Sun-Times this weekend is, I call it, do you believe in miracles? Yes, the famous Al Michaels line from the 1980 Olympics when the hockey team beat the Russians. In Maywood, which has been arguably the most dysfunctional suburb in Cook County. We've done a dozen investigations of problems there. They finally ousted the mayor. An independent candidate won, which is so unusual. Nothing changed in Cicero. Nothing changes in most of the suburbs where you assume that they're going to kick rascals out. But in Maywood, an independent actually beat the longtime incumbent, which told me that change is possible when people begin to pay attention. Unfortunately, that's only one suburb. We need that in hundreds of them.
I'd be happy if we could just get most school districts, and this is going to surprise you, get most school districts to go back to teaching civics. It's outrageous.
Isn't that a crying shame when you go into the high schools, and I don't think people even, they couldn't tell you how many aldermen we have in Chicago. They probably couldn't even tell you what their alderman's name is. They probably don't know what the offices under the mayor are, what other city offices are there. Would they know there's a clerk and a treasurer? Could they tell you the offices in Cook County? I agree with you. It's a crying shame. But when the kids can't read and write and do basic math, some would argue that they better start with that. But I agree with you. I wish civics was still mandated. I remember you and I, we took the Constitution test in 8th grade. That made us all sweat bullets. And we had to remember the articles and the amendments and all that. A wonderful learning experience.
And in the half minute we have left, give a plug for your awards event coming up.
May 7th at the Mesereau Auditorium, we're going to celebrate the best in investigative reporting in the Midwest. If you want information about that or anything else, go to bettergov.org. This is the one pitch in this show. Bettergov.org has all of our content. It says everything about us. And maybe most importantly, you have a chance to become a member of the BGA. I can't do this alone. If you want better government in Illinois, you have to vote, but you also have to support watchdogs who are fighting for you. That's what we do. BetterGov.org has great information, but it also has a chance to say, I care, I support these activities, I'm going to become a member. It costs $25, which is less than a ticket to the Cubs, and we're winning a lot more.
That's Andy Shaw of the BGA, the Better Government Association. Thank you, Andy, for coming in.
Always a pleasure, Bill. See you soon.